I dropped the truth like a bomb at my sister's wedding dinner, and in the blast that followed, I finally saw what I had always been to them. A ghost at the table. Subscribe to Revenge with Roxy. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from as you join us on this journey. Welcome to Revenge with Roxy. The rehearsal dinner was a masterclass in performance art. Crystal glasses chimed, silverware whispered against porcelain, and the air was thick with the suffocating perfume of my sister's chosen peonies. It was a perfect scene from a perfect life I was never quite a part of. My mother, the director of this production, turned her high-wattage smile on me, her eyes glittering with triumph. "Everything is just perfect, isn't it?" she mused, before landing the inevitable question. "When will it be your turn, Cal?" The table's polite chatter seemed to fade into a dull roar in my ears. I saw my sister preen beside her fiancé, my father nodding along with a story he'd heard a dozen times. This was the moment I'd rehearsed in the quiet of my own mind, the one I'd both dreaded and craved. I let the question hang in the air, a poisonous little dart. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, held my mother's gaze, and smiled. "It already happened," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the noise. "You just weren't there." Silence. Not a gentle pause, but a hard, violent vacuum that sucked the air from the room. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Smiles withered on lips. "My name is Cal Monroe. I'm 32. And if you think this is a simple story about a forgotten invitation, I need you to understand that the deepest betrayals aren't the loud, explosive moments. They are the slow, silent poison of realizing that to your own family, you are so fundamentally irrelevant. They wouldn't even notice you were gone." The room was a tableau of glittering champagne flutes and suffocating, well-dressed guilt. My father cleared his throat, a sound like a stone cracking under pressure. My sister's blinks were frantic, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape from a conversation she hadn't approved. That's not funny, Cal. You're joking, right?" she managed, her voice thin. I set my glass down on the white linen, the sound a soft, definitive click. "No." My mother's perfectly made-up face contorted, her eyes wide with the shock of a queen being checked by a pawn. "When?" she whispered, the word barely a breath. 6 months ago," I said, keeping my voice steady, a lighthouse in the storm I had just unleashed. A quiet courthouse ceremony. Just us. No drama, no fuss. The light in her face collapsed. Her lips parted with the kind of raw, indignant shock that only a shattered expectation can create. You didn't tell us." "No," I confirmed, letting the words settle. "You were a little busy," I gestured around the opulent room, planning her perfect day. "In the last year, did you once ask if I was seeing anyone? If I was happy?" The silence was my answer. They hadn't. Not once. My life had become an afterthought, a subplot to be dealt with after the main credits rolled on my sister's story. When Asher proposed, I didn't share the news. The joy was too fragile, too pure to be subjected to their scrutiny. I held it close, not out of shame, but as a shield. I was building a fortress around my happiness, protecting it from the inevitable comparisons, the quiet judgments, the thousand subtle ways they had made me feel like a spare part in a life that was supposed to be, at least in part, my own. I remembered calling my mother a month before I got engaged, bubbling with excitement about a promotion at work. "That's nice, dear," she had said, her voice distant, before immediately pivoting. "Now, have you seen the proofs for Charlotte's invitations? The calligrapher used the wrong shade of ink. It's a complete catastrophe." I had quietly hung up, the joy draining out of me, leaving a familiar, hollow ache. So we eloped. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a reclamation. There was no cathedral, no string quartet. Just me, Asher, and a vast windswept sky the color of steel. We spoke our vows on a cliffside overlooking the ocean, the wind whipping my simple dress around my legs, tearing the words from our lips and carrying them out to sea. It was real. No venue drama, no seating charts, no maternal tears over linens that weren't quite the right shade of ivory. It was just love, stripped down to its honest, powerful core. A week later, I mailed them a single photograph. It was a shot of me and Asher, our heads thrown back in laughter. My joy so genuine, it felt like it could leap off the paper. It was an olive branch. A final, hopeful test. No one replied. Not a call. Not a text. Not even a cursory congratulations. The silence was louder than any argument. So tonight, when my mother asked her question, I gave them the truth they had so clearly never sought. Raw, clean, final. Across the table, my sister stared at her hands, refusing to meet my eyes. My mother took a large, sharp swallow of her wine, as if trying to wash down a bitter poison. And my father, for the first time all night, looked directly at me and asked something that mattered. Is he good to you, Cal? I held his gaze and nodded, a wave of unexpected sadness washing over me. Yes, I said softly. He's better to me than you ever were. Later, as the disastrous dinner party was being dismantled around us, the silence began to fray. My mother, a master of salvaging her own narrative from any wreckage, cornered me by the door. You should have told us, she said, her voice laced with that familiar rehearsed tremble she used for emotional leverage. As your mother, I had a right to be there. I almost laughed. A right? I raised an eyebrow, the exhaustion of it all settling deep in my bones. I turned to my sister, who was hovering nearby. That's funny. You didn't seem to think I had a right to be at yours, remember? Because I hadn't forgotten. Oh, I had tried. I hadn't forgotten the vague non-answers when I asked about the date, the suddenly lost invitation in the mail, and the final, brutal text message that had landed on the morning of her wedding. So sorry for the chaos. We assumed you'd be too busy with work to make it. But I hadn't been busy. I had cleared my entire weekend. I had sat alone in my small apartment, dressed in clothes I'd bought just in case, watching their perfect day unfold on social media. The pictures flooded my feed like a storm of confetti I couldn't escape. My sister's radiant smile as Dad walked her down the aisle. My mother's happy, glistening tears. My father's proud, booming toast to his perfect family. I scrolled and scrolled, my heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against my ribs, my face hot with a shame that wasn't even mine. And in that quiet, lonely room, I finally accepted the devastating truth. They hadn't forgotten me. They had deliberately excluded me. I was the background sister. The self-sufficient one who never needed help. The one who made unconventional choices, who didn't follow the sacred script of tradition. So, I had finally written my own. My wedding had no script. No matching dresses, no tiered cake, just vows we wrote ourselves, spoken on a windy hilltop. Our hands were clasped so tightly I could feel the beat of his pulse. Our eyes locked in a silent pact of defiance against a world that says love only matters when it's witnessed and approved by a crowd. I didn't post a single photo. I didn't need their validation. Back at the dinner table, my father sighed, the sound impossibly heavy. Why didn't you tell me? He asked again, and the softness in his voice almost fooled me. It almost made me forget his toast from my sister's wedding video, the one a cousin had sent me. I could still hear his voice, thick with emotion. We're so proud to have one daughter who is finally doing things the right way. The words had been a knife, twisting in a wound I didn't even know was still open. I looked him dead in the eye. You didn't ask, I said simply. None of you did. They only saw me when I was a mirror, reflecting their own image, their own expectations back at them. But I was done. I was shattering the mirror. And across the table, for the first time in my entire life, I watched my sister's perfect, confident smile completely vanish. Finally, she spoke, her gaze dropping to her untouched dessert plate. I didn't think you'd want to come to my wedding, she mumbled. You always make everything about you. The accusation was so stunningly ironic, it was almost brilliant. This from the woman whose wedding preparations had included 5 separate dress fittings, a tear-filled crisis over the exact shade of blush peonies, and a binder a literal 3-inch binder detailing every second of her special day. I tilted my head, my anger now cold and precise. Deliberately not inviting someone and then inventing a justification for it after the fact doesn't make you thoughtful. It makes you a coward, She flinched as if I'd struck her. So did my mother. My father gripped his fork like it was a shield. But I pressed on, not to inflict pain, but to force them, for once, to bear witness to the truth. I was never going to be the sister who looked perfect in your bridesmaid photos. I was never going to be the quiet, smiling prop that made your love story look bigger by comparison. That's not fair, she whispered, her lip trembling. Neither was me sitting at home, scrolling through your wedding photos and wondering what I had done wrong while you all clinked champagne glasses. I retorted. The problem was never just the wedding. It was the years of revisionist history. The lifetime of being labeled dramatic for having feelings, of being called too intense, too independent, too much, and yet, somehow, when it came to one of the most important days of her life, I was not enough to even be invited. My mother, sensing a total loss of control, swooped in. Well, it's over now. What's done is done. Maybe we can all just move forward. I shook my head, a slow, sad finality washing over me. See, that's the thing, Mom, I already did. I moved forward without you. Her face fell like a chandelier cracking from its chain. I stood up, my legs feeling surprisingly steady. I folded my napkin and placed it gently on the table. I didn't come here tonight to start a war. I came to finally and completely set the record straight. I looked at my sister, her face pale and shocked. You got the wedding you wanted. I looked at my parents, their faces a mask of confusion and anger. You got the daughter you celebrated. Then I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. And I got the peace none of you ever offered me. And with that, I turned and walked out, leaving behind the only seat I'd ever truly been assigned at their table. The empty one. 3 days passed in a cold, tactical silence. Not a call, not a text. It was the kind of quiet that is wielded as a weapon. Then, on a Wednesday night, an email from my mother landed in my inbox. The subject line was simply, dinner. The message was short and sharp. You blindsided us. Your sister is heartbroken. There was no need for such a scene. No need. I stared at the screen, the words blurring. That scene was my voice. It was one single solitary truth spoken at their table after decades of silently swallowing my own reality to make theirs more palatable. I didn't reply, but they weren't finished. 2 days later, my sister posted a throwback photo on social media from her wedding day, a professionally shot image of her and my parents, all beaming. The caption was a masterpiece of passive aggression. Some people watch from the sidelines, some people vanish. Real love always shows up. The comments section quickly filled with a predictable parade of digital loyalty. Distant cousins, family friends, all chiming in with their support. So true. You are surrounded by so much love. It was a public performance of her victimhood, and they were all playing their parts perfectly. I didn't flinch. They could spin the narrative however they wanted. I had already lived the truth. That night I told Asher everything. He was folding laundry, a mundane and grounding task in the middle of my emotional storm. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice. He just listened. When I was finished, he quietly folded a towel, walked over to where I was sitting, and kissed my forehead. Let me ask you something, he said softly. Do they even know your favorite flower? The question was so simple, so profound, it knocked the wind out of me. They didn't. In 32 years, they had never known. But Asher did. Calla lily. A month before we eloped, I had come home to find he had dug up a small patch of our rental's front garden and planted a dozen of them. Now your name lives in the garden, he'd said, his hands covered in dirt. That was the difference. My family gave me roles to play. Asher gave me a garden to grow in. They never asked why we eloped. They never noticed how light I had become once I stopped performing daughterhood like it was an exhausting, unpaid and unappreciated role. I moved on with my life, letting their silence be the closure they would never give me. Until another email arrived. This time from Dad, it was just 5 words. Can we talk? Just us. I hovered over the message for a long time. Sometimes the ones who stay quiet after a truth bomb are the ones who finally heard the echo. And sometimes, they're just the ones tasked with gently luring you back into the fold before you realize you're already free. I took a deep breath, my heart a strange mix of hope and dread, and typed back. We'll see. Dad picked a diner. Neutral ground. It was the same worn-out vinyl booth place we used to go for milkshakes after my childhood violin recitals, a ghost of a simpler time. He was already there when I arrived, hands folded around a half-empty coffee cup. For a fleeting second, I saw the dad I remembered from those days, steady, quiet, a man whose thoughts were an impossible country to map. I'm not here to take sides, he said, as I slid into the booth. I raised an eyebrow. It's a little late for that. Dad, you've been standing on their side for years. He had the grace to look down, nodding slowly. I know. The silence stretched between us, pulled taut with everything unsaid. Then he looked up, his eyes weary. You getting married without telling us? It hurt, Kel. I didn't flinch. You not calling me, not texting me, not even asking where I was on the day of your other daughter's wedding? That hurt too. He looked down again, his thumb tracing the chipped rim of his cup. I didn't know how far it had gone, he murmured. The resentment. Between you and your mother. You and Charlotte. I let the excuse hang in the air. Dad, it didn't go anywhere. It stayed exactly where it always was, unequal. I was the moon and they were the sun. I only existed in their reflection. You all seemed perfectly fine with that arrangement. He didn't argue. He didn't defend them. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his worn coat and slid a slightly creased photograph across the Formica table. It was the one I'd sent. Me and Asher, windblown and incandescently happy, my simple dress caught mid-spin. I kept this, he said, his voice quiet. I kept it in my desk drawer. Your mom. She said it was disrespectful, that you did it to hurt her. I stared at the photo, the memory of sending it rushing back. My hands had been trembling when I put it in the envelope. It was one last attempt, one final desperate flare sent up into the darkness of their indifference. I didn't know how to reach you, he added, his voice barely a whisper. Not without her listening in, not without it turning into another fight. I leaned back against the vinyl, the old hope I had felt flickering and dying. Then maybe don't try to reach for me until you're willing to speak in your own voice. Instead of whispering around hers, his eyes softened, filled with a sadness I hadn't seen in years. I miss my girl. I carefully picked up the photo, my photo, and tucked it into my purse. I'm not lost, Dad, I said, my voice gentle but firm. I just stopped walking in your direction. He nodded again, offering no defense, no pleading. Just a quiet, defeated acceptance. And maybe, in that small greasy spoon diner, he finally understood. I hadn't abandoned the family. I had just stopped waiting for them to meet me on a bridge they had no intention of crossing. 2 days after the diner, my mother appeared at my door. Unannounced, uninvited. She didn't even get out of her car at first. Just sat there, engine idling, like a lawyer preparing her closing arguments. Sunglasses on, jaw set like granite. Finally, she emerged and strode up the walkway. I opened the door before she could knock. She stood there, arms crossed, lips pursed into a thin, disappointed line. I suppose your father ran to you and told you I'm the villain now. I didn't answer. Because evil isn't always cloaked in darkness. Sometimes it wears pearls and speaks in sighs of martyrdom. I raised you better than this. Kellen, she said, using my full name like a weapon. Did you? I replied, my voice calm, a placid lake she could no longer stir into a storm. She exhaled, a puff of pure indignation. You embarrassed us. You humiliated your sister on what was supposed to be a happy occasion. No, I cut in, my patience finally gone. I answered your question. You asked when my turn would be. I told you. You want to talk about humiliation? Let's talk about my lost invitation. Let's talk about being a family secret. That scene at dinner wasn't an attack. It was honesty. The silence between us swelled, a cold war fought without a single sound. Then she stepped closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The way she did when she was about to deliver her most lethal blow. "You've always needed too much," she hissed. "So much attention. So much validation. So much space." The line was designed to pierce the deepest part of me. The old wound of too muchness she herself had carved. But this time it didn't land. It glanced off an armor I didn't know I had until this very moment. She didn't know I'd already unpacked that wound, piece by painful piece, with Asher and therapy and the quiet, unconditional stillness of a marriage she had never bothered to ask about. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw her not as my mother, but as a painting I had once loved. Now seeing it for what it really was, all brilliant technique but no heart, no truth. "You didn't lose a daughter, Mom," I said, my voice devoid of anger, filled only with a sad clarity. "You just lost the version of me you could control." She blinked, momentarily stunned. "You think you're better than us now? With your little secret life?" "No," I said. "I think I'm just done bleeding for applause you were never going to give." For the first time, she had no response. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just turned, her back ramrod straight, and walked back to her car. The engine roared to life. No wave, no final glance, just taillights fading down the street. I closed the door without guilt, without sorrow. Because not every ending needs a dramatic slam. Some just need the quiet click of a lock finally turning. A week later, the package arrived. A thick, cream-colored envelope with gold embossing, the Monroe family crest etched in the corner. It wasn't a letter. It was my sister's wedding album. There was no note. It was just there, a peace offering, or a final provocation. Asher watched me from the kitchen counter as I slid it open. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked gently. I nodded. Sometimes closure isn't about what you want to see, but what you're finally ready to face. I slid the heavy book from its sleeve. The first few pages were predictable. A glossy pageant of manufactured joy, dress fittings, champagne flutes, my father walking a radiant Charlotte down the aisle. Then, the reception. There was my mother mid-toast, her eyes glassy with pride, reciting a long, scripted quote about daughters, dreams, and destiny. I flipped another page and my blood ran cold. It was a formal family portrait, taken in front of the fireplace at the reception hall. My father, my mother, my sister, and her new husband, my grandparents. All of them, poised and smiling. And there, standing between my mother and father, was a young woman. And at the bottom of the photo, in elegant gold script, were the names. Including mine. Kellum Monroe. Except the person in the photo wasn't me. It was my cousin from Vermont, same height, same dark hair, wearing a dress suspiciously similar to one I had once worn to a family graduation. They had replaced me. They had found a stand-in, a prop, and put her in my spot. They had framed it, labeled it, and planned to place it on their mantle. A perfect, smiling lie in a silver frame. They had faked my presence at a wedding they hadn't invited me to. Asher came to stand behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders. His whole body went rigid. "They replaced you," he said, his voice tight with a rage I couldn't yet feel past my own shock. "No," I whispered, the horror crystallizing into a single, sharp point of clarity. It was so much worse than that. They erased me. And they didn't even think I'd notice. I slid the heavy album back into its pristine envelope. I didn't tear it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply walked to the kitchen drawer, took out a thick black permanent marker, and wrote one word across the front of the beautiful, expensive packaging. Return. The next morning, I dropped it in the mailbox. No angry note, no lengthy explanation. Because when someone deletes you from the frame of their own perfect story, you don't fight to get back in the picture. You stop being the background. You start being the author of your own. They never responded. Not to the returned album, not to the single word scrawled across it, not to the unspoken truth screaming from inside it. And that silence, the final deafening silence, it didn't ache. It clarified. I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come, for a version of history that would never be reprinted. Instead, I started building. Asher and I found a little venue by a lake, just a wide porch, strings of twinkle lights, and enough space for 30 chairs. We sent out simple invitations, calling it a celebration of honesty. It wasn't a second wedding, not a do-over. It was a gathering of our real family, the people who had actually shown up for us all along. Old friends from college, colleagues from work, 2 elderly neighbors who brought a homemade apple pie. There was no seating chart, no expectations, no relatives who needed to be emotionally managed, and when I stood on that porch, in a simple white sundress, facing the 30 souls who had come to witness our love, I read our vows again. But this time I read them aloud, my voice clear and strong. And I didn't cry. I breathed. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could get enough air in my lungs. Because healing isn't always a poetic, beautiful process. Sometimes it's just the gritty, quiet work of honoring what was real, in front of the people who never made you feel like love was a prize to be earned. Afterward, a friend asked if my family was coming. I smiled, a genuine, gentle smile. No, I said. They already attended a wedding. It just wasn't mine. That night, back at home, I pulled the last box of my past down from the top of the closet. It was filled with artifacts from a life that no longer fit, old birthday cards with my mother's flowery script, framed quotes from her about being a strong daughter, a beautiful, silk bridesmaid dress from a friend's wedding years ago. I placed it all carefully in a donation bag, not with rage, but with a profound sense of relief. At the drop-off bin on 7th Street, a young girl in line behind me pointed to the bag. "That's a really pretty dress," she said. I turned and smiled at her. "It was never really mine," I said, and as I walked away, the empty bag swinging from my hand, feeling lighter than I had in years, I finally understood. Family isn't the people who share your name or your blood. It's the people who see you. The people who know your favorite flower. The people who never have to ask twice where you were when it mattered.